We're going to be discussing Japan in these video lectures. And Japan is an island nation, and so it leads to a certain type of cultural development. I always think because they are living with smaller amounts of land, right, and a more insular culture, it creates a very tight-knit community and society. And it also creates, in my mind, a focus on essentialness in what is needed. Where they, for instance, one of the examples I always think about is they create like flexible spaces in their homes with the use of the sliding right walls, right, the paper walls, right, the Takami walls. So this idea of having flexibility, thinking about essential nature, it's something that to me is very Japanese. And they are very, again, inward turning in a lot of ways. For a long time, they really didn't have any interest in trading with the outside world. They would often have skirmishes and wars with China. And so, even though we would expect they'd be more connected to other Asian cultures, that often wasn't the case. So they seem to hew very closely to what is Japanese. And if you look at the map, of course, we're going eastward again, right? We're still working our way eastward on the globe. As I mentioned, we would. You just keep on rolling eastward, right, on that globe. The subjects that I talk about when talking about historical Japan is I first talk about in great depth the idea of nature and Japanese culture. And then I give you a little bit of a discussion of Buddhism as well. Because as we've noted many times, Buddhism travels out of India, it goes to other locations, and of course it's going to end up here in Japan also. But the natural world, I think, is really the lens that I'd like to look at historical Japan through. So that will be sort of the framework of our conversation. And I've broken that into 4 different areas of interest. I wanted to talk first about Shinto, which is the earliest religion of Japan. So, kind of the equivalent to like Tao, right, in Chinese culture. I also wanted to talk about the painting and the prints that are made in Japanese culture and how they have a strong connection to nature as a subject matter. Would then move into the discussion of Zen gardens, which is very particular to the Buddhism of Japan. And finally, we'll conclude by talking about the tea houses of Japanese culture. So starting first with Shinto. It is what's called the sacred way, or the way of the gods. And it revolves around the idea of kami. And kami is like energy. And they believe that each living thing had kami, or energy within it. I often compare kami to the idea of qi in Chinese culture. So if you go back and look at our discussion of the Forbidden City, for instance, I talked about the idea of qi, or the energy, right, that ran through the earth and, impacted all things. Um, to me, kami is very similar to the idea of qi. And so I'm showing you here a little picture of a garden. Again, we'll be talking about Zen gardens a little later on. But if you think about the idea of Shinto, they said, kami is in everything. It's in everything around you. So Shinto is obviously very connected to nature. So they'd say that tree has kami, right? The stone has kami. The river, the creek, right, has kami. Everything around you has kami. The idea that the natural world, right, is filled with the spirit or the essence of this kami, in a sense, that's in everything around you. Now, this doesn't mean that Shinto practitioners didn't build architecture, because they did. They often would have large gates that separated the sacred and profane worlds. They called them Toranas. So if you think about walking up the steps, you could be walking up, right, again, in your profane world, the world of the everyday. And then you cross through the gates, you cross through the boundary into the sacred, in a sense. You might remember you've seen this before, right? If you go back and look at the stupa of Sanshi, right? And I didn't really get too much into the classification or the terminology here, but they were basically Torai, right? They were the same kind of thing, just a slightly different term that went along with it. But this idea of a gate or a marker that sort of separates the sacred and the profane, we see this in many cultures and in many usages. So here you see that you'd use the Torana, or the gate, and you would pass through into the world of the sacred. And then after you pass through the gate, you typically would encounter a Shinto shrine or a Shinto temple of some kind. And notice the use of the color red, right, is very common in Shinto practitioners, for Shinto practitioners. It has that same equivocation to energy like it does in Chinese culture, so you see it used frequently here. And you'll notice the style of architecture that's used here always uses kind of these roofs with these flipped up edges. That's very, very common in Japanese architecture to see these roofs that kind of the edges flip up at the end. So that's a typical thing you'll see with the architecture. When you go inside a Shinto shrine, what you would encounter are different objects of meditation or different objects that had sort of energy, they'd say, or kami. And so you would go in a shrine and perhaps you would see like a sacred stone, or you'd see a sacred teacup, or something of that nature. So each of the shrines will have some kind of point of reflection or object linked to kami. Notice most of these spaces are pretty pared down, they're pretty simplistic. Lots of use of natural woods and, again, the rice paper walls, right? The futama walls. So they basically would basically try to use the natural world as much as possible, right, in the design of these kind of spaces. The most famous Shinto shrine is the Grand Shrine at Ise. And you can find different various videos on this where you can see the different construction processes and different things. So I try to include some things for you there. And the Grand Shrine at Ise is actually linked back to the sun goddess, who is said to be the ancestor of the Japanese emperors, the figure of Amaterasu no Ami Kami. Notice that Kami is in her name, so the idea of like energy itself, right, is in her name. And you'll note that this shrine is said to house the sacred mirror that is linked to the goddess. So as I noticed, there's usually some kind of object or something that that people could focalize their energy on when they come to a Shinto shrine. So here at this shrine, it's the sacred mirror related to the sun goddess, and again the ancestor of the emperors. Now the shrine is interesting as well because every 20 years it's ritually dismantled, taken apart, destroyed, and then rebuilt. And this all happens under the auspices of the imperial family, right? It's something that they are in charge of, essentially. And it's a way of showing their honor to their ancestors, right? To Amaterasu herself. But it's an interesting sort of, act because basically they have to cut down all new trees. They have to go through all the motions of reconstructing this temple. And many people talk about the damage it does to the ecology in the region, having to rebuild this thing every 20 years. It's a very large undertaking. I saw once where they estimated it costs like in the millions of dollars to do so every 20 years. But the reason why it's done is because in Shinto practice, they believe in the act of cleansing, ritualistic cleansing in a sense. So this every 20-year cycle is a ritualistic cleansing of the space, cleansing of the energy. When you go to a Shinto shrine, by the way, the way that you even have to go into the space is about cleansing yourself. Often Shinto shrines, you enter them from underneath, where you have to go on your hands and knees. It's a way of prostrating yourself. Other shrines have rituals where you have to wash out your mouth, your face, your mouth, wash your hands, right? This idea of cleansing your body. So there's these different ways at each Shinto shrine that you could like ritualistically cleanse or prostrate yourself or make yourself, bow before the gods in a sense, right? Bow before the kami or the energy of the universe and bow before Amaterasu in this sense at this shrine. So it's interesting how it's very nature focused and very focused on this idea of cleansing the spirit, cleansing the body, cleansing the mind in order to interact with the space itself. It's a little over the top, but it's interesting to consider how this works. And Shinto, as I mentioned, is considered the oldest religion of Japan. So along with Tao in China, it's interesting to see that they both cultures have this religion that focuses a lot on nature and the natural world, and sort of simplicity, how to pare something down and make it very, very simple. And today Shinto is still practiced in Japan, but is often practiced alongside Buddhism. I'm also going to talk to you about painting and prints, and we'll look at that in the next lecture.